He thought separating them would help. It almost destroyed them. By the fourth night without sleep, Caleb Whitner stopped trusting instinct and started trusting advice. Doctors said the crying was attachment. Lawyers warned about liability. Security stood ready to restore order. Renee Lawson was still the one the triplet girls reached for: Eliza, Margot, and Clara, 3 tiny bodies that only settled when her voice was close enough to feel. So Caleb gave the order. Pull her away. He believed distance would teach independence. He didn't realize it would teach fear. Most people think the damage happens when someone is taken away. It doesn't. It happens in the silence that follows, when the children stop crying and start shutting down. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The nursery on the 3rd floor of the East 72nd Street mansion had become a war zone. For 72 hours straight, the Whitner triplets, Eliza, Margot, and Clara, had screamed themselves hoarse, their tiny faces red and slick with tears. No bottle worked. No rocking helped. The night nurses had quit one by one, citing impossible conditions. Caleb Whitner stood in the hallway, staring at the security monitors mounted outside the nursery door. His empire had been built on control, on calculated decisions that moved markets and crushed competitors. But 3 8-pound girls had brought him to his knees. On the screen, he watched Renee Lawson enter the room. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was hired to clean, not care for children. Yet the moment she crossed the threshold, something shifted. The crying that had torn through the mansion for days began to soften, then fade, until an eerie silence filled the monitor's audio feed. Caleb pushed through the nursery door. Renee stood between the 3 cribs, her hands moving in slow, deliberate patterns, not touching the babies, just present. Eliza's breathing had steadied. Margot's fists unclenched. Clara's eyes, bloodshot from days of crying, finally closed. Why do they stop crying when you're here? Caleb's voice was raw, stripped of its usual command. Renee didn't turn. They listen before they understand. The words made no sense, yet Caleb couldn't argue with results. He'd spent $40,000 on Dr. Helen Crowley, Manhattan's most sought-after pediatric specialist. She'd found nothing wrong. Most people would assume this is normal newborn trouble. That assumption is what makes the next decision dangerous. I'm doubling your salary, Caleb said. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Renee finally looked at him, something unreadable flickering in her dark eyes. Money won't fix what's broken here, Mr. Whitner. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Doctor, Crowley's message glowed on the screen. We need to discuss unhealthy dependence patterns. This level of attachment to household staff isn't sustainable. The doctor's warning echoed in Caleb's mind as he watched Renee whisper something too quiet for him to hear, and all 3 babies exhaled in perfect unison, finally surrendering to sleep. Dr. Helen Crowley sat across from Caleb in his study, her leather portfolio open to pages filled with clinical observations. The morning light through the floor-to-ceiling windows did nothing to soften the severity in her expression. If this continues, they won't self-regulate, she said, tapping a chart with her pen. Your daughters are forming a dependency that will cripple their development. They need to learn to self-soothe, Mr. Whitner. This attachment to the maid is a behavioral pattern we must break now, before it becomes permanent. Caleb rubbed his temples. He'd slept 4 hours in the past 3 days. What are you recommending? Complete separation. Remove Miss Lawson from all contact with the children for a minimum of 72 hours. It will be difficult, but necessary. The study door opened. Paige Monroe, the family attorney, entered without knocking, a privilege reserved for emergencies. We need to discuss liability exposure, she said, her voice clipped and efficient. If something happens to those children while under the care of untrained domestic staff, you're looking at negligence claims that could destroy you. Legally, Dr. Crowley's recommendation isn't just sound, it's protective. This is where most people stop listening because they think protection can't hurt. Caleb stood, walking to the window overlooking East 72nd Street. 3 floors above, his daughters were finally sleeping. Peaceful. Safe. Because of Renee. "What if you're wrong?" he asked. Dr. Crowley's expression hardened. "Mr. Whitner, I've been doing this for 23 years. I'm not wrong." He thought of his own childhood. The nannies rotated every 6 months to prevent attachment, the boarding schools, the calculated distance his father had called preparation for leadership. It had made him strong, hadn't it? "Then we stop it. Tonight." Caleb pressed the intercom. "Marcus, come to my study." The head of security arrived within minutes, his posture military straight. Caleb gave the instructions quickly, clinically, as if ordering a corporate restructuring rather than severing the only connection that brought his daughter's peace. "Be ready at 10 o'clock. Remove Miss Lawson from the nursery. Reassign her to the ground floor indefinitely." Marcus nodded. "Understood, sir." As they left, Caleb returned to the window. Caleb ordered Renee removed from the nursery, telling himself it was the right decision, the kind of hard choice that separated good fathers from weak ones. 3 floors above, he couldn't hear the babies sleeping. Soon, they'd be screaming again. 10 o'clock arrived with the precision of execution. Marcus Bell stood outside the nursery with 2 security personnel, their footsteps muffled by the hallway carpet. Through the cracked door, he could see Renee humming something wordless, her hands moving in those strange, deliberate patterns above the cribs. All 3 girls were drowsy but still awake, that dangerous window before sleep. He checked his watch. Orders were orders. Marcus pushed the door open. "Miss Lawson, I need you to come with me." Renee turned, her eyes widening. "Not yet. Please, they're almost asleep. 5 minutes. I have my instructions." Marcus stepped forward, professional but firm. "Please, 5 minutes." Renee moved between Marcus and the cribs, not aggressive, just present. "If you wake them now, they won't settle for hours. You know this." Marcus did know. He'd heard the screaming that had driven 3 night nurses to quit, but he also knew Caleb Whitner's tone when an order wasn't negotiable. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, nodding to the other guards. They moved with practiced efficiency, 1 on each side, guiding Renee toward the door by her elbows. Not violent, not cruel, just unstoppable. "If you leave here, you'll believe everyone meant well." "Wait, just let me." Renee twisted, reaching back toward the cribs even as they pulled her through the doorway. The movement woke Eliza first. Her cry started as a whimper, then built into a shriek that woke Margot, then Clara. Within seconds, all 3 were screaming with a desperation that seemed to shake the walls. Renee stopped resisting, her body going still. "You don't understand what you're doing." Marcus released her in the hallway, already reaching for his radio to report compliance. Behind them, the nursery filled with sounds that didn't belong to children, something raw, more primal. The girls screamed as Renee was pulled away, their voices rising into frequencies that made the security guards wince and reach for their ears. On the monitor in his study, Caleb watched the feed and told himself this was temporary. Just a reset. Nothing more. The nursery became a tomb. For the first hour after Renee's removal, the triplets screamed with such intensity that Lillian Frost, the unshakable house manager who'd worked for 3 generations of wealthy families, had to step into the hallway to steady herself. But by hour 2, something worse began. The screaming stopped. Not because the babies had calmed, but because they'd simply stopped. Eliza stared at the ceiling with glassy eyes. Margot's breathing turned shallow and mechanical. Clara's tiny fists, which had been flailing in rage, went completely limp. Dr. Crowley arrived at midnight, her confidence from earlier replaced by clinical concern. She checked vitals, pupil response, reflexes. Everything was technically normal, but the babies wouldn't track movement, wouldn't respond to voices, wouldn't take bottles. "They're shutting down," Dr. Crowley said quietly, the admission costing her. "I've seen failure to thrive cases, but not this rapidly, not in healthy infants." Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, watching 3 tiny bodies that looked like they were already leaving. This is usually where people click away. It's also where the cost becomes undeniable. Lillian appeared at his shoulder, her voice stripped of its usual formality. They won't respond to anyone, Mr. Whitner. Nothing works. The bottles, the movement, the sound machines, it's like they've decided to stop fighting. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd made hard decisions before, fired thousands, dismantled companies, walked away from his own father's deathbed for a merger. But watching his daughters fade because of an order he'd given was different. This wasn't business. This was blood. Bring her back, Caleb whispered. Sir. Marcus stepped forward from the shadows. Bring her back, now. Caleb's voice cracked. Find Renee. Marcus was already moving, radio pressed to his lips, barking orders. Caleb approached the cribs, reaching down to touch Eliza's hand. She didn't respond, didn't grip his finger the way babies were supposed to. 20 minutes later, footsteps echoed in the hallway, uneven, hesitant. The nursery door opened. Renee returned, bruised, shaking, her uniform torn at the shoulder and dark marks visible on both arms, where hands had gripped too tightly. She stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, her eyes meeting Caleb's with something that looked like both accusation and exhaustion. Then she saw the babies, and nothing else mattered. Renee didn't ask permission. She moved past Caleb, past Dr. Crowley's startled protest, past every protocol and boundary that should have existed. Her hands were trembling as she reached the cribs, but her voice when she spoke was steady, that same wordless humming that had worked before. Eliza's eyes tracked first. Just a flicker, but it was there. Renee gathered all 3 babies, something the staff had been told never to do. That it wasn't safe. That proper procedure demanded separation. She lowered herself onto the daybed near the window, cradling all 3 against her chest, and simply held them. The girls fell asleep instantly, their breathing synchronizing with hers in a pattern that seemed impossible for 3 separate bodies. It was only then, in the lamplight, that Caleb saw the full extent of it. Bruises ringed both of Renee's arms, purple-black fingerprints, where the security guards had held her. Her left shoulder showed abrasions through the torn fabric. A cut above her eyebrow had bled and dried. What did they do to you? Caleb's voice was barely audible. Renee didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the babies, her hand moving in slow circles across Margot's back. They did what you asked. The words were simple, factual, but they landed like a verdict. Dr. Crowley cleared her throat. Miss Lawson should be examined. Those injuries can wait, Renee interrupted quietly. They need this more. Caleb sank into the rocking chair across from her, watching his daughters sleep peacefully for the first time in days. Most people think this is the relief. It isn't, because now he understood what he'd done. The separation hadn't been a reset, it had been a severance. His daughters hadn't been learning independence. They'd been experiencing abandonment so profound it had shut down their will to survive. And Renee had absorbed the violence of that choice in her body. Caleb realizes the separation caused the collapse not just of his daughters, but of the lie he'd been telling himself about what strength actually meant. In the silence, with 3 babies breathing in perfect rhythm against a woman who shouldn't have mattered this much, Caleb Whitner felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Shame. Dr. Helen Crowley returned at dawn, this time without her portfolio of certainties. She stood in the nursery doorway, watching Renee sleep upright on the daybed with all 3 babies still pressed against her chest. The monitoring equipment she'd set up hours earlier told a story that contradicted everything she'd recommended. Their heart rates, Dr. Crowley said quietly to Caleb, who hadn't left the room all night. Look at the synchronization. The monitors showed 3 separate readings that moved in near perfect harmony, rising and falling with a 4th rhythm that could only be Renee's heartbeat. When Renee's breathing deepened, the triplets' respiratory rates adjusted within seconds. When her pulse steadied, theirs followed. Co-regulation, Dr. Crowley continued, her voice carrying the weight of admission. Infants borrow emotional regulation from their primary attachment figures. It's neurological, not behavioral. They borrow calm. She is the calm. Caleb leaned against the window frame. You said this was unhealthy dependence. I was wrong. The words came hard, but Dr. Crowley didn't flinch from them. What I interpreted as dependence is actually a profound regulatory relationship. Some children, particularly those born premature or under stress, require external co-regulation longer than others. Your daughters aren't choosing Renee over self-soothing. They're using her nervous system to learn how their own should function. And if we remove her again? Dr. Crowley looked at the bruises visible on Renee's arms, then at the peacefully sleeping babies. You risk real harm. Not just emotional distress, actual physiological dysregulation. What we saw last night wasn't a tantrum. It was their systems shutting down because the regulatory source was severed. If you stop here, you'll think this was just fear. But it was more than that. The forced separation had triggered something primal, a survival response that made the babies believe they were alone in a way that threatened their existence. And Renee had absorbed the violence of that severance in her own body, carrying bruises that told the story of a mistake disguised as protection. Caleb approached the daybed, looking down at his daughters. Eliza's tiny hand clutched Renee's sleeve. Margot's cheek pressed against her shoulder. Clara's breathing rose and fell in perfect time with the woman who held them. Renee's bruises become proof of a mistake, evidence written on skin that good intentions and expert advice could still inflict wounds that might never fully heal. What do we do now? Caleb asked. Dr. Crowley closed her medical bag. You let her do what's already working, and you protect that not from her, but for her. Marcus Bell had served in 2 wars before becoming head of security for the Whitner estate. He'd followed orders that saved lives and orders that haunted him. But standing in Caleb's study at 8 in the morning, he knew which category last night belonged to. I followed protocol, Marcus said, his military bearing intact, but his voice uncertain. Your protocol hurt someone under my roof. Caleb's words were measured, not angry, which somehow made them land harder. I gave you an order that was wrong. You executed it perfectly. And a woman who's done nothing but help my children now has bruises that say we failed her. I crossed a line, Caleb continued, meeting Marcus's eyes. Not you, me. I chose control over care. I listened to fear instead of watching what was actually happening. Marcus nodded slowly. What are your new orders, sir? Renee's safety is now primary protocol. She doesn't get removed, redirected, or questioned unless she requests it. And anyone who touches her without cause answers to me directly. After Marcus left, Paige Monroe arrived with revised household policies. The attorney who'd warned about liability now reframed everything around duty of care, not controlling who comforted the children, but ensuring whoever did had support, resources, rest. Protection isn't about barriers, Paige said, sliding the documents across Caleb's desk. It's about creating conditions where people can do what they're meant to do. Caleb found Renee in the kitchen that afternoon, holding an ice pack to her shoulder while Lillian prepared her lunch. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. I owe you more than an apology, Caleb said. You owe me boundaries, Renee replied quietly. Your daughters need me, but they need you too. They needed you to stop pulling them away from what worked, because experts said you should. The words were gentle but firm, not accusation, just truth. I'm listening now, Caleb said. Renee set down the ice pack. Then listen to this. I can't do this if I'm afraid you'll change your mind again. They feel everything. If you're uncertain, they're uncertain. If you're fighting this, they're fighting. Walking away now means missing who finally takes responsibility. Caleb pulled out a chair, sitting across from her not as employer to employee, but as someone trying to understand. Teach me, not how to replace you, but how to support what you're doing. Caleb chooses presence over control, understanding for the first time that true strength isn't about making hard decisions, it's about admitting when you've made the wrong one and staying present for the repair. Renee studied his face, looking for something. Whatever she found must have been enough, because she nodded. They wake up at 6, she said. Be there tomorrow. 6 o'clock came with the soft gray light of early Manhattan morning. Caleb stood outside the nursery door, coffee in hand, feeling more nervous than he had before billion-dollar negotiations. Through the cracked door, he could hear Renee already inside, that wordless humming weaving through the air like something ancient and instinctive. He pushed the door open quietly. Renee looked up from where she sat between the cribs, her hands moving in those deliberate patterns he still didn't fully understand. The bruises on her arms had faded to yellow-green, but they were still visible, a reminder written on skin. "You came," she said simply. "I said I would." She gestured to the rocking chair near the window. "Sit there. Don't talk. Just be present." "Renson." Caleb obeyed, watching as Renee worked. It wasn't magic, he could see that now. It was attention, patience, the willingness to read 3 different babies as 3 different people, responding to Eliza's need for gentle pressure, Margot's preference for rhythmic sound, Clara's desire for visual focus, and underneath it all, something he was only beginning to understand. The steady, unshakable calm of someone who had decided these children were worth staying for, even after being hurt for caring. The morning feeding went smoothly. The afternoon naps synchronized. By evening, Lillian had prepared dinner, and the household moved with a rhythm it hadn't possessed before. Not perfect, but functional. Human. At 8 o'clock, Renee began the bedtime routine. Caleb remained in the rocking chair, a silent presence. He watched his daughter's eyes grow heavy, watched them fight sleep the way babies do, watched them finally surrender. By 9 o'clock, all 3 were sleeping deeply. The nursery fell into a silence that felt earned rather than forced. Renee stood slowly, stretching her back, and moved toward the door. Caleb stood too, suddenly aware that she might leave, go to her room. Her life. The space she deserved away from this constant need. "Stay," Caleb said quietly. Renee paused in the doorway, looking back at him with those dark, knowing eyes. "I already am." The words carried weight beyond the moment, a promise, but also a challenge. She would stay, but not because he'd ordered it. She would stay because she'd chosen to, and that choice demanded he meet her halfway, that he show up, that he learn. Most people won't stay long enough to understand what safety really costs. It costs pride. It costs the illusion of control. It costs admitting that expertise isn't the same as wisdom, and that sometimes the person who knows best is the one you almost threw away. Caleb returned to the rocking chair as Renee settled onto the daybed. Neither spoke. There was no applause, no dramatic reconciliation. Just 2 people committed to keeping 3 babies safe, not through force or authority or expert opinion, but through presence. Through the window, Manhattan glittered with 1,000,000 lit windows, each one holding its own struggles, its own moments of getting it wrong before learning to get it right. In this room, on this night, 3 babies slept through until morning. Protection isn't force. It's learning who the children trust and why. It's understanding that real strength means staying present even when you've failed, especially when you've failed, and letting the people who know how to love teach you what you've forgotten. The house that never slept finally rested, and in that silence, something like healing began.